Welcome to the Moss Report with your host, Dr. Ralph W. Moss.
Hi, this is Ralph Moss, and welcome to the Moss Report. Today on our podcast, we have a very special guest, William B. Grant. And Dr. Grant is, dare I say, the leading writer and expert in the United States on the topic of vitamin D and specifically the use of vitamin D in the prevention of disease. And we want to talk, of course, specifically about cancer. Um, Dr. Grant is the director of the Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Center in San Francisco, and the author of an extraordinary 284 publications on vitamin D that are listed at PubMed, the government's database on all medical topics. And I noticed, Bill, that your latest publication was with two scientists whom I greatly admire: Bruce Ames, who is an emeritus professor at your alma mater, UC Berkeley, and
Right.
also Walter Willett, who's recently retired, I believe, but the leading epidemiologist at Harvard. So you're hanging out in some very impressive company, and I think it's a indication of how far you've come in the 20 odd years that you've been working on this with your incredible persistence, that you've brought this topic of vitamin E to the forefront, really, of many people's consciousness. So welcome to our program.
Well, thank you. It's good to interact with you.
Yes, and we have corresponded before. About I looked up, I see that about 10 or 11 years ago, when I was coming to California to speak, we had some correspondence at that time. But it looks to me like the the topic that you are, dare I say, really preeminent in, which is the interrelationship of vitamin D with health, has really taken off in recent years. And so I wanted to talk to you about that and what this what this struggle has meant for you personally, how this happened. Because one thing that I find so interesting is that you really are kind of an outsider insider, in the sense that your PhD is in physics from Berkeley. I mean, it's fantastic credential, but um, maybe some people might find it surprising that you have become a health expert, basically. So I'm wondering, how did that transition happen?
Okay, it's an interesting transition. When I was working for NASA Langley Research Center in Virginia, I also volunteered with the Sierra Club and got involved with a project to look at how acid rain and ozone were affecting the eastern hardwood forests.
Hmm.
And in doing that, I learned from a forestry professor, Ori Laux, how to do the ecological study approach, where you treat populations as defined geographically as entities, and then you look at the statistics, um, say for disease outcome or forest outcome versus the risk modifying factors.
Hmm.
And after I learned this in 1996, I read that in Hawaii, the Japanese American men there had 2.5 times the rate of Alzheimer's disease as native Japanese. My mother had Alzheimer's, and I knew people with Alzheimer's probably had more aluminum in their brains. And I recalled from the forestry study that acid rain frees up aluminum, and the trees pick that up and go into decline. And I figured, well, probably the American diet is the reason they have more Alzheimer's in Hawaii than in Japan. And I can prove that by doing an ecological study. And so I got the dietary supply data from 10 countries, the prevalence of Alzheimer's, and show that total fat and total energy supply were highly correlated with Alzheimer's disease. Fish modified the risk, reduced the risk a little bit, and countries that had mainly a rice-based diet had very low rates of Alzheimer's. I had
Very, very
that,
low, had low rates.
yes,
Uh-huh.
like India and China and Japan.
Hmm.
And I had that vetted by the University of Kentucky and then published in their journal, Alzheimer's Disease Review. And I hired a press agent, went to DC, and announced to the world that diet was a main risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I made the national TV news with Dan Rather and CNN. And it was like hitting a home run at my first time at bat in the major leagues. And here I was, an atmospheric scientist at NASA who was studying ozone and aerosols and going on international trips. But I was really more of an instrument manager and not really a scientist. Now, all of a sudden, I found that if I combined two data sets, I could really make some progress. And then the next study I did was on sugar and heart disease, showing that for an ecological study again, that for heart attacks and globally, added sugar was the main risk factor for women, but for men it was animal fat. And it turns out John Yudkin had talked about sugar being the main risk factor in the 60s, but
Yes.
Ansel Keys talked about animal fat. And Ansel Keys did all the studies on men, and he argued stronger than John Yudkin did. And so it was the fat was the big bugaboo, and sugar was not accepted because they didn't understand that you eat sugar, you form triglycerides, they clog the arteries just as saturated fat does.
Mm-hmm.
The Heart Association finally realized that about a decade ago, but they couldn't get on board back in 1998. Then in 1999, the Atlas of Cancer Mortality Rates from the United States from 1970 to 1994 was published. It had these beautiful maps with 5 shades of
Yes.
red, 5 shades of blue.
I remember that. Yeah.
And I posted some of the images on my website, SUNARC.org. And at first, I tried to find the dietary links to the cancer, but that didn't work. I mean, we essentially have more or less the same diet countrywide. Then I went back to the paper by Cedric and Frank Garland from 1980.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when they were beginning graduate students at the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, they saw the early maps from the National Cancer Institute, which had only 5 grades of shading. And they had just driven from San Diego to Baltimore. They knew it was very hot, very sunny in the Southern California, southwestern United States, not very sunny in the Northeast. And so they said to themselves, well, it's got to be sunlight. And the most important effect of sunlight is production of vitamin D. Therefore, vitamin D must reduce the risk of colon cancer. It took them 6 years to get that study published, and then it was in a British journal, the International Journal of Epidemiology. That was in 1980. They then went on and did a study separately on breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and more on colon cancer. But they weren't getting much traction, and they sort of lost hope. So I came along in 1999 with seeing the new maps, and I got the NASA data for solar UVB doses at the Earth's surface for June 1992, and had to digitize that map to the 500 some odd state economic areas in the cancer atlas maps, and finally got that all together and did the analysis just for UVB, and I sent that to the journal Cancer in 2002.
UVB meaning ultraviolet.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, that's a short wavelength of UV. It's
Mm-hmm.
about 3 or 4% of the total UV hitting the Earth's surface.
Okay.
And UVA is the longer wavelengths. So UVB is from 290 to 315 nanometers. I confused my units here. Um, so the reviewer said, "Great paper, but get it edited by a text editor." I did. It got published. And then the critic said, "Well, why did you leave out the states along the border of Mexico? And why didn't you include other risk modifying factors?" So I finally realized that the problem along the border was a lot of Mexicans lived in these border states, and they had a lot of H. pylori infection and a high rate of stomach cancer.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't realized that at first. And when I put in all these other factors, I got the same results for UVB and vitamin D. But now I showed that yes, smoking was a big risk factor. Poverty was a risk factor. It depended on whether you're urban or rural resident and whether you drank alcohol. And I sent it back to cancer, and they said, well, it's interesting, but we'll pass. 8 other journals passed. They just didn't want to get ahead of the curve on and really promote vitamin D.
Hmm.
Finally, I got Cedric Garland involved as a co-author,
Hmm.
and we got our paper published in a Greek journal, Anti-Cancer Research, as a result of the proceedings for a UV and vitamin D cancer um, conference in Germany.
Hmm.
So, this paper's got maybe 200, 300 citations by now, so it's accepted. So the first paper in 2002 then encouraged other people to think about cancer more carefully. And Robert Heaney and Joan Lappy's group at Creighton University reanalyzed the data they had from a clinical trial and show that, aha, yes, women taking vitamin D and calcium has significantly lower incidence of cancer than the women taking just calcium or taking placebo.
Were they given
So,
this in the course of a trial prospectively?
yeah, they were studying osteoporosis
I
and the
see.
effect of vitamin D and calcium on
Okay.
osteoporosis.
Uh-huh.
Because until the year 2000, the only known benefit of vitamin D was reduce risk of bone diseases and ricket, for example, rickets.
Hmm.
I mean, ecological studies are not given any credibility in the medical system, and they really hadn't looked much at the observational studies for vitamin D
Hmm.
and cancer or anything else. So, so this, if you looked at the number of publications on vitamin D, there was one slope, about 10 or so percent increase per year until 2002. Then after this publication, went up more like 20% per year because now the field was open. Well, if it can do cancer, what about cardiovascular disease? What about diabetes? What about infections?
Hmm.
And so the field really started taking off then.
Yes, that's a profound effect. Um, what what is your overall opinion in terms of preventing cancer? Should most people be increasing their exposure to sunlight? Should they be taking a supplement? If they do take a supplement, I know you're going to tell me that it has to do with the level of the optimal level of the vitamin in the blood, but is there a safe level that people could take that would be beneficial to the vast majority without running the risk of any toxicity?
Okay, first go back to the maps I produced. If you look at the maps today, there's much less of an evidence of UVB reducing risk of cancer. That's
Uh-huh.
because people are heavier. They've been convinced by the dermatologist that sun is bad. You've got to wear sunscreen, including in the makeup. You've got to
Hmm.
cover up. You've got to not get not sunburn, et cetera, et cetera. And also, it turns out even if you do go out in the sun every day in the United States, half of the year you can't make any vitamin D, and even
Why
if you
is
do
that?
make
Oh, you mean just
ah,
because the sunlight is just too weak,
yeah,
too oblique?
it depends on the solar zenith angle or elevation angle. If
Mm-hmm.
your shadow is shorter than you are, you can make some vitamin D. If it's
Mm-hmm.
longer than you are, you really can't.
I
So you've got
see.
to be within a couple of hours of solar noon during the summer, and forget about it during the winter unless you're in the southern Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you do make vitamin D, well, it's shown that vitamin D levels go up in the summer to maybe 28 to 30 nanograms per milliliter for whites, and around 20 nanograms per milliliter uh, in the winter. So it's about a 20, maybe a 30% variation summer to winter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on the other hand, if you take vitamin D, you can raise your level to 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 nanograms per milliliter. Now, okay, the Institute of Medicine claimed that you could take 4,000 international units of vitamin D per day, which would
Mm-hmm.
be safe for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But they admitted that they saw no adverse effects up to 10,000 IU per day, and other studies have shown even up to 30,000 IU per day, there's very little adverse effects.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, for example, I take around 5,000 IU per day,
Mm-hmm.
and my 25 hydroxyvitamin D, which is the vitamin D level measured by your doctor, is around 60 nanograms per milliliter. Now,
Mm-hmm.
two studies, so grassrootshealth.net is an organization that promotes vitamin D. And they also enroll people in studies where they're allowed to take whatever vitamin D doses they want, and every 6 months they're sent a blood spot kit so they can draw blood and send it back, and within 2 weeks find out what their vitamin D level is.
Mm-hmm.
And these tests are very accurate, cost about $70,
Mm-hmm.
and they've been used now in clinical trial in observational studies. And anyway, what they've shown, and I've got one of the maps here in front of me. They looked at the frequency distribution of breast cancer incidence by 25-hydroxyvitamin D measured within within a 6 months or a year prior to diagnosis of cancer, breast cancer. So they find that those who got up to 70 nanograms per milliliter had 80% reduction in breast cancer incidence compared to those with around 25 nanograms per milliliter, which is about right for average white Americans, and about even a little bit more reduction for 16 nanograms per milliliter, which is what you have for African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for overall cancer, all types of cancer, they showed about a 70% reduction for whites and about an 80% reduction for blacks. So and this is based both on using their volunteer participants, as well as those who took part in the Lapihini studies from Creighton University, and they would look at each categories by different vitamin D levels.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, if you look at the VITAL study out of Harvard
Mm-hmm.
by Joanne Manson and colleagues, published in 2019, they were limited by the National Institutes of Health to 2,000 IU per day.
Huh.
And now I'm not sure why they did that. My own idea is that maybe they didn't want to show an effect of vitamin D. And what
Uh-huh.
happened was, and then the people enrolled in the study had a mean or median 25-hydroxyvitamin D of 31 nanograms per milliliter. So if you looked at the results for the entire 25,000, half of whom are given vitamin D, and others were allowed to take up to 800, 600, 800 IU per day, even if they weren't on the trial, you didn't have a significant effect of vitamin D. But if you looked at those with a base BMI, body mass index,
Mm-hmm.
less than 25, they had a significant 25% reduction in cancer incidence. And the African Americans had an almost significant reduction of 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had omitted the first 1 or 2 years of the study, you had about a 25% reduction in all cancer mortality. So,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, the New England Journal of Medicine only permits one outcome to be reported in the abstract, which was no effect. You had to go into the paper, look at the look at the secondary results to find there was an effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is one way the medical journals that work for big pharma can sort of disguise the results and keep on track that there's no benefit for vitamin D.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It gets so many things that you've brought up, but in effect, they gave an ineffective dose of vitamin D, um, and then they announced that that it has no benefit. I mean, that's it sounds
Right.
like, when in fact, if you go into the data, there were, for some categories, there was a benefit. Now, did you say, I didn't quite catch this? Were you saying that people with the higher body mass index had less of an effect or less benefit than the people who were more slim? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, because uh, as Robert Heaney pointed out, there's a dilution effect. The larger the
Hmm.
mass, the lower the vitamin D level for the same
Sure.
vitamin D dose.
Right. Right.
And
Wow.
another study
Yeah.
on diabetes, on progression from prediabetes to diabetes, where they were out of Tufts University, were allowed to use 4,000 IU per day, and they showed that under BMI of 30, there was a benefit.
Hmm. Hmm. And what do you hear in terms when you bring these issues up with more conventional researchers are skeptical, people are skeptical, what sort of arguments do you most frequently get thrown at you?
Well, if the study, report, the word from Harvard is observational studies don't mean anything. Ecological studies we can forget. Clinical trials are the only thing that matter.
Mhm.
And so, it's hard to argue with that point of view. On the other hand, I know an oncologist at UCSF here in San Francisco who gives all of his cancer patients 50,000 IU vitamin D per week. He uses
Uh-huh.
D2, which you can obtain by prescription, which is
Uh-huh.
not as effective as D3, which you
Uh-huh.
can also get over the counter very
Right.
inexpensively at 50,000 IU per day, even from
Uh-huh.
Amazon.
Uh-huh. This would be Don Abrams, probably.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yes, not too many sympathetic integrative oncologists at UCSF, but he's certainly that. But so you're saying the more effective form is the one that the consumer could actually get on their own.
Right, right.
The D3.
Yeah,
Is there?
so D2 is made from fungi and mushrooms and the like, and yeast.
Uh-huh.
And it's a different molecular form. It doesn't last so long in the body.
Uh-huh.
It hasn't been proven as effective in clinical trials
Yeah.
as D3. D3 is generally made from sheep's wool lanolin that's UVB treated and purified,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the same form as we make in our body.
Mm-hmm.
And some people think that there's a difference between sun-produced vitamin D and oral vitamin D. There
Mm-hmm.
isn't if it's D3. On the other hand, there are some extra benefits of sunlight exposure.
Mm-hmm.
It's recently become knowledge that first of all, UVA, the long wave UV, helps
Mm-hmm.
liberate nitric oxide from nitrogen compounds under the
Mm-hmm.
skin. And nitric oxide can lower blood pressure,
Yes.
but it can also fight viral infections. And
Mm-hmm.
there's two very good papers on that recently by Weller and by somebody else out of England, showing that this is one of the ways that sunlight reduces the risk of COVID-19. And as we know now, there's sort of a pause in the COVID-19 pandemic this summer.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
around October, November, when the
Uh-huh.
sun goes down and the vitamin
Yeah.
D levels go down, the
How
nitric oxide
interesting.
levels go down, it's
Right.
going to start coming back. And right now they're claiming, oh, it's the vaccine that's doing it. Well, not
Yes.
exactly. It's maybe contributing, but
Yes.
nature has a way of fighting it as well.
So we saw the same pattern last year in a way, although later in the summer it did pick up tremendously. But
Right.
going into most of the summer, it seemed as if it was greatly diminished, and nobody explained that dip. And
Uh-huh.
I see you do have some articles that you've written about COVID and vitamin D. Um, our focus here is on cancer, of course, but it's all very fascinating. People should look up your
Hmm.
articles in PubMed, and there's some other places like scholar.google.com where they can
Right.
probably get the full text of many of your
Right.
284 publications on this field. So, what about prostate cancer, though? This seemed to be a sort of a mixed bag, as it were, when it came to preventing prostate cancer.
Yeah. My hypothesis is the following. First of all,
Well,
it's
why don't you
shown
state what
in,
that is? Yeah, state
well, okay.
what the problem is. Yeah.
Okay. The problem is that at higher levels of vitamin D or greater sun exposure, there's
Mm-hmm.
actually an increase incidence for prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, higher vitamin D levels are associated with reduced risk of aggressive prostate cancer, the one that
Mm-hmm.
kills you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, um, what? Okay, as we mentioned earlier, the classical effect of vitamin D is to increase calcium and phosphorus absorption and regulate metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out that calcium and more likely phosphate are are risk factors for prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Drinking milk is a risk for prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So you raise your vitamin D levels, you're going to increase your calcium uptake, and that can then increase the risk of these minor non-virulent prostate cancers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, on the other hand, uh, the mechanisms of vitamin D for reducing cancer death includes, first of all, effects at the cellular level. They sort
Okay.
of vitamin D operates through through genes. You take in vitamin D, it's converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and then when it gets another hydroxyl group, it becomes 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, or calcitriol, which is the hormonal version, which can go into the vitamin D receptors that are in every cell, and they're coupled to the chromosomes, and they can affect gene expression, upregulating maybe a few thousand, downregulating a few hundred.
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, and it goes in and interrogates a cell and asks, well, cell, do you belong in this organ? And if so, we will let you differentiate and proliferate. If you don't, we'll just have you commit suicide or apoptosis.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way this immune surveillance is one way to keep cancer rates down.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, then, if the tumor starts to develop, it needs angiogenesis. It needs blood vessels
Mm-hmm.
growing around the tumor to supply the nutrients it needs. Well, vitamin D can sense that, and vitamin D can help retard the angiogenesis around tumors. And then, in order to, if a tumor is just isolated, just in a self-contained place, it's not going to do much except grow. It's got to really invade other tissues,
Mm-hmm.
has to metastasize, and vitamin D has several mechanisms to reduce metastasis.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that um, like in the cancer mortality maps that I show on my website, vitamin D, sunlight has produced vitamin D to fight cancer at all these stages. If, on the other hand, you get somebody who's got cancer and it's already gone through the angiogenesis, it's already maybe going to the metastasis stage,
Mm-hmm.
you've lost some of the benefits of vitamin D. And so I did a search of literature this morning and found that it's sort of mixed evidence on whether treating cancers at the later stages has much benefit. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really a matter of trying to prevent. But also, you want to use vitamin D as an adjuvant manner, going along with whatever other modalities
Well, for
your
sure.
oncologist.
Right. Nobody's going to just do that alone. But I guess the question would be for a person who has prostate cancer or has had prostate cancer, um, is it is it a smart thing to do to take 5,000 units of vitamin D per day, let's say?
Yes, in fact, that study was done by uh, Bruce Hollis and colleagues and
Mm-hmm.
Marshall at Medical University of South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
They took men with low-grade prostate with tumors. They did a biopsy.
Mm-hmm.
They then put them on 4,000 IU vitamin D per day for a year and checked, and they found that there was a reduction in the number of biopsy cores compared to those who are on the placebo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Well,
this study is,
was it a significant reduction?
yes, it was significant. It was published in
Uh-huh.
2012.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a very impressive thing. So in other words, it's basically down regulating the cancer to the point where maybe the men wouldn't need immediate action in terms of their cancer. Did they have biopsies
yes, both
to
both
test?
both before and after. Both.
So you're saying that the Gleason scores went down on average in the people who were taking the vitamin D?
I think that's correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's tremendous because there's a cutoff point beyond which you have to take action if you have a prostate tumor, and if you have like a Gleason 6 or even a lower grade Gleason 7, you can do what's called active surveillance. You don't have to have treatment right away. So
Right.
could be a very important part of a holistic approach to this incredibly common form of cancer. Um,
Yes.
and what's the difference? I mean, I was looking just before for another purpose, looking on Amazon at vitamin D supplements, and you know, there's so many. First of all, secondly, I think most people would be shocked by the price of vitamin D, and I mean that shocked by the low cost of it. We've gotten so used to $150,000 and up for cancer treatments, and it's hard to find a vitamin D pill that costs more than a quarter. And in fact, some of the very good brands seem to be 3, 4, and 5 cents per day per pill. Am I right?
Right. My sponsor is Biotech Pharmacal,
Uh huh.
and if you buy the 50,000 IU pills, you get 100 of those for $30,
Uh huh.
and that's about $10 for your supply at about 5,000 IU per day. It's now
But
in Europe.
why would you take 50,000 though?
Ah, the half-life of 25-hydroxyvitamin Z is about 2.5 weeks. So
Uh-huh.
pharmacologically, you can take something at half the half-life or so. On the other hand, as Bruce Hollis has shown, there are some benefits of having daily vitamin D. It's sort of a matter of compliance and convenience.
Uh-huh.
Um,
I
you can do
see.
either.
Oh, so people are taking a big mass or a very large dose, 50,000. There's no danger in that?
Well, take it once a week.
Even so, there's no
No, no,
danger?
no, no danger. No, no. You can
Uh-huh.
process about 25,000 IU per day. I mean,
Uh-huh.
that's about what you can make in the sun. So the body is up to
Uh-huh.
producing. And if you haven't been taking vitamin D, and you want to up your 25-hydroxyvitamin D level,
Yeah.
what you should be taking is over a period of a week or two, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 IU of vitamin D3, and then drop off to maybe 5,000 IU per day after that. Otherwise, you're
Uh-huh.
going to take several months to get your level up to the
Uh-huh.
50, 60, 70 IU per nanograms per milliliter.
So you say take 100 to 300 IU per day for how long?
No, 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 no. Take
No.
50,000 a day,
Oh. Uh,
50,000, say 2 or 3 times a week. So
Uh-huh.
you're getting 150,000 a week. And so you do that for 2 weeks. So you've got 300,000 IU. Can then, that'll then boost rapidly your 25 hydroxyvitamin D.
Uh-huh.
And there's no adverse. I mean, there have been finding that if you take 300,000 IU and then do nothing more, you might have increased risk of falls and fractures. But
Uh-huh.
they don't understand why, and it could be because all of a sudden you're more energetic and you're
Uh-huh.
walking more and falling.
Uh-huh.
But uh, in terms of hypercalcemia, which is the biggest risk factor from overdosing of vitamin D, there's a
Yeah.
story about a vitamin mineral guru who found out about vitamin D and told his manufacturer, put 1,000 IU per day in my scoop. Well, the
Yeah.
manufacturer confused micrograms and milligrams and put a
Oh yeah.
million IU per day.
I
He
remember
got to
this.
900
Yeah.
nanograms per milliliter,
Yeah.
and he had
Ah.
bloody feet and couldn't think straight. Michael
Yeah.
Holick got involved,
Uh-huh.
tested things, found out what the story was,
Yeah.
helped him reduce his level. When he got down to 400 micro nanograms per milliliter, his hypercalcemia went away. So
Uh-huh.
this thing now it turns out that the Institute of Medicine was worried about these U-shaped curves between
Yeah.
25 for vitamin D and health outcome. Well,
Mm-hmm.
what I showed was that many of these observational studies had enrolled people who just started supplementing with vitamin D shortly before entering the trial
Mm-hmm.
and the observational study.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably were told by the doctor, you have osteoporosis, start taking vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
And so they went from, they should have been categorized as maybe 20 nanograms, they were categorized as 70 nanograms. And then they developed cancer 2 years later because they had low levels beforehand.
Yeah.
Uh, none of the vitamin D supplementation studies that go up to at 5,000, 10,000 IU per day, um, none of them show a U-shaped relationship. It's only these observational studies where they didn't control for when did you start taking supplements.
Right. And also, it's the same problem with doing randomized trials with nutritional factors, like happened with the vitamins, the Linus Pauling, the Mayo Clinic study of
Right,
vitamin C, where they found that there was elevated levels of vitamin C in the people who were not receiving the vitamin C. So you have a real problem when you're using an over the counter and you're studying it. This is also what happened with Laetrile at the Mayo,
right,
same people at the Mayo Clinic, that when people enter a study, no matter what it is, and they're randomized, let's say they want to study pistachio nuts and see if they're beneficial for heart disease. Well, now you've got the idea implanted in your head that probably they wouldn't be doing the study if pistachio nuts weren't good for heart disease. So the people who are in the study, who are being randomized, don't want to run the risk that they're not going to get the benefit. So they start
Right.
eating pistachio nuts. I mean, just making
Right.
up an example, but there's many, many examples of this. So, there's a kind of a fetishism about randomized controlled trials. And look at all the studies that Walter Willett has done. And most of what our knowledge is about the health effects of different foods and the effect on cancer don't come from randomized trials. They come from,
Right.
people's recollection of what they ate. So I think, there are various ways that clinical trials can be either have built-in mistakes and prejudices, or can be deliberately manipulated to come up
Right.
with a result that people might want. And I can't
And
help but feel that it's a kind of this is sort of the epitome of the two-edged sword, in the sense that if you come up with something that's really cheap, that's really of benefit to people in the health field, well, you're going up against incredibly powerful and wealthy sources that want to compete in the same space that you're talking
right.
about.
Right. So cancer industry is what, 100 billion, 120 billion, 130 billion a year.
At
And
least.
I just was
Yeah.
just doing a quick calculation this morning.
Yeah.
And with the results from the grassroots health, it looks like half of the cancer rates could be reduced by beginning people up to 60, 70 nanograms per milliliter. That could wipe $50 billion off the industry.
Right.
And of course, they're not going to stand by idly and say, oh, yes, let's prevent cancer.
Right. Well, I mean, you have forces in the society that want to prevent cancer, want to, if only for the reason that you could greatly reduce, I mean, not to mention the human suffering, but, from a purely material point of view, you can greatly reduce the cost of healthcare. But then what people don't understand is that there is this countervailing force, which is we call big pharma, which basically makes their money off of more illness. I mean, and so if you've got a drug like Kymria, which is $475,000 for one infusion, which is sort of the record at the moment, and with the side effects, they figure that the cost of treating a patient with that infusion, as CAR-T cell therapy, would be about $1.5 million, and then you're
Hmm.
talking about something that will come to $5 or $10. It's no
Right.
contest. Everybody should
Yeah.
love this treatment, but on the other hand, we see paradoxically that every obstacle imaginable is put in the way of treatments like this.
Yeah. And I wrote an article published at Orthomolecular Medicine News Service in 2018 about how big pharma uses the disinformation playbook, just like
Hmm.
lung, the
Yes.
smoking, and tobacco and sugar and et cetera did. And
Hmm.
for example, Michael Hollick is actually the world's best known vitamin D expert,
Yeah.
and there was a hit piece on him in the New York Times a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
And they'll publish these fake studies, like these clinical trials that weren't done right.
Yeah.
They'll put their people in the head of the Food and Drug Administration, NIH, and CDC, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
It's just sad.
Yeah. A lot of people, I think it'll be eye-opening to them to hear this interview, because I mean, you are a person of incredible accomplishments, and you're dealing only with the highest level of other researchers who, like the Garlands and like Hollick, and of course Bruce Ames, whom I interviewed many many years ago, but one of the top biologists in the country. Walter Willett is the godfather of nutritional studies. So you're definitely in there with the people who are the most prestigious people in the country, I would say, in terms of their research, their medical research, and yet, you're still, in a way, it hasn't been at all embraced or endorsed by the mainstream. And
Right,
I don't see the danger in this, with that one exception of the prostate thing. But prostate cancer isn't so scary unless it's of the aggressive variety. I mean,
right,
it's still a bit scary, having gone through it myself. But logically, rationally, we know that there's a huge difference between a, a prostate cancer that you're probably die with rather than of, and something that could really, get out of hand and kill you. So if it decreases the risk of dying from prostate cancer, that's the most important thing. And I'm
Right,
not so,
right.
and I just can't help but feel that there's some glitch in the way that study was done. I don't know enough about it to be able to say, but it sounds like it's a pretty sure bet that people should be increasing their vitamin D intake and their vitamin D levels, so that they'd be in the optimum range. I mean, that seems so
Y-
obvious.
Yes. And as opposed to pharmaceutical drugs, vitamin D has mainly health benefits:
Right.
reduced risk of diabetes, respiratory infections, autoimmune diseases, falls and fractures,
Yes.
dementia, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And
Um,
the cost is ridiculously low. So
right.
it's got everything going for it. So uh, I guess this is a word to the wise. People who are listening to this podcast should take this to heart and look into this some more. And what's your website?
SUNARC.org, SUNARC.org.
Okay, great. And then they could find out about your sponsor. You said, want to say that again about who your
That's
sponsor is?
that's Biotech Pharmacal in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Mhm. Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's just been a great pleasure, and I'm so glad that we've connected up again after so many years. We're talking to William B. Grant, PhD, the director of Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Center in San Francisco. And his website is, as he said, www.sunarc.org. So for the Moss Report, this is Ralph Moss.
Thank you for listening to The Moss Report. Visit our website at themossreport.com and subscribe to hear more discussion of cancer treatment options, alternative research, and more. For more information about Dr. Moss and his work, including scheduling phone consultations, go to mossreports.com.